I need to confess something I've never told anyone. It's not a secret you can see. Nothing physical ever happened. No one would call it cheating. But it still weighs on me every time I'm alone with my thoughts. I replay moments I never acted on. I question choices I quietly allowed. And I wonder when restraint stopped being enough. I'm a woman in a committed relationship that looks stable from the outside. We share routines, plans, and a life that most people would call solid. I wasn't searching for attention, excitement, or an escape. I didn't go looking for trouble, and I never intended to cross any obvious line. But somewhere along the way, I found myself carrying something I couldn't name, and couldn't let go of either. Before I continue, I want to know how this sounds to you so far. Leave a comment and tell me what you think this confession is really about. And if you appreciate honest, uncomfortable stories like this, subscribe and share the channel so more people can join the conversation. I didn't wake up one day knowing I had something to confess. There wasn't a clear beginning, no moment I could circle and say, this is where it started. That's part of what makes it so heavy now. It grew quietly, in ordinary moments, without asking for permission. At first, everything felt normal, almost forgettable. Just conversations layered into routine, familiar environments, shared spaces, nothing that would raise suspicion or even curiosity. If someone had been watching from the outside, they would have seen nothing unusual. And that's exactly why I felt safe not questioning it. I told myself I was just being friendly. I told myself I was just being polite. I told myself that connection doesn't automatically mean intention. And for a while, I believed that. But slowly, I started noticing myself in ways that made me uncomfortable. Not what I was doing, but how I was reacting. How my mood shifted before I had time to think about it. How certain conversations stayed with me longer than they should have. How silence felt different depending on who I was sharing it with. None of it crossed a visible line. That became my shield. There was no touching. No messages sent late at night. No words spoken that couldn't be explained away. And yet, I felt myself becoming more careful, more aware, more conscious of how I was perceived. That awareness didn't feel accidental. It felt chosen. What scared me was how natural it all felt. I didn't feel reckless. I didn't feel dishonest. I felt present, engaged, seen in a way that didn't demand anything from me. And that made it harder to label as wrong. When something doesn't feel forbidden, you don't guard against it. You let it sit. You let it grow. At home, nothing changed in ways that anyone could point to. We talked. We planned. We shared space the way couples do when they believe things are steady. That stability became another excuse. If nothing is wrong here, I thought, then nothing else can be wrong either. But that logic started to crack. I caught myself editing stories before telling them. Not lying, just simplifying, leaving out details that felt unnecessary to explain. I didn't ask myself why I was doing that at first. I told myself it was about clarity, not concealment. But the truth was harder to ignore. If something doesn't need to be hidden, it doesn't need to be filtered. That realization sat with me longer than I wanted it to. I started asking myself questions I didn't like. Questions with no clean answers. Was I protecting my relationship or protecting my comfort? Was restraint enough if my thoughts were already drifting somewhere they didn't belong? And why did the idea of stepping back feel heavier than it should have? The worst part wasn't the guilt. It was the quiet sense of recognition. The feeling that something inside me had shifted, even if nothing around me had. And once you notice that shift, you can't pretend it isn't there. I didn't feel like someone on the verge of cheating. I felt like someone standing too close to something unnamed and not moving away. At this point, do you think noticing the pull is already a line crossed? Once I admitted to myself that I felt a pull, I expected things to become clearer. I thought awareness would give me control. Instead, it made everything heavier. The feeling didn't intensify in a dramatic way. It settled. It became something I carried quietly, something that followed me through my days without demanding attention, but never letting me forget it was there. I started noticing how often my mind returned to the same place, not obsessively, not in a way that disrupted my life, but consistently. And consistency has weight. It turns fleeting thoughts into patterns, and patterns into habits you don't remember choosing. I paid closer attention to my reactions. Not to him, to myself, to how quickly my mood shifted in certain moments, to how easily my attention lingered, to how natural it felt to stay engaged just a little longer than necessary. None of it felt reckless. None of it felt wrong enough to stop. That was the problem. I told myself all the right things. That attraction doesn't equal intention. That thoughts aren't actions. That discipline is proven by restraint, not avoidance. Those explanations sounded mature, rational. They gave me a sense of superiority, even. As if acknowledging the feeling without acting on it made me more evolved, more in control. I clung to that idea because it allowed me to stay exactly where I was, without admitting anything had to change. What made it more complicated was how calm I felt on the surface. I wasn't spiraling. I wasn't fantasizing about a different life. I wasn't imagining scenarios or planning outcomes. That calmness became my evidence. If this were dangerous, I told myself, it would feel chaotic. Instead, it felt contained, managed, almost responsible. But control can be deceptive. I began anticipating interactions without realizing I was doing it. I noticed how my mind prepared itself, how I considered what might be said, how a conversation could unfold, how it might make me feel. That anticipation didn't feel impulsive. It felt deliberate. And once I noticed that, it became impossible to ignore. At home, I stayed present. But something had shifted. I was still attentive, still engaged, still affectionate. Yet part of my emotional energy felt allocated elsewhere, even when I didn't want it to be. I hated that about myself. It felt unfair, especially because nothing concrete had happened to justify it. That's when the guilt started to take shape. Not loud, not overwhelming, just persistent. A quiet pressure that followed me during ordinary moments, while folding laundry, while brushing my teeth, while lying awake beside someone who trusted me fully. It wasn't accusing me. It was asking me questions I didn't want to answer yet. I asked myself whether this was how emotional distance actually begins, not with dissatisfaction or conflict, but with divided attention, with the slow redirection of curiosity and care, even when everything looks intact on the outside. I thought about creating distance, about pulling back just enough to let things fade naturally. That idea sounded reasonable, mature even. But every time I imagined it, I felt resistance, not panic, not fear, reluctance, the kind that tells you something already matters more than you want to admit. That realization unsettled me deeply, because it forced me to confront a truth I had been avoiding. I wasn't choosing him over my partner, but I was choosing not to let go. And that choice, however quiet, felt intentional. I told myself I was waiting for clarity, for the feeling to pass, for something external to resolve it for me. But clarity doesn't arrive when you keep feeding ambiguity. It waits for you to stop pretending the situation is neutral. I started adjusting my boundaries without fully acknowledging it. As long as nothing physical happened, I was safe. As long as words stayed appropriate, I was fine. As long as no one knew, no one was hurt. Those rules made sense, until I realized how often I reshaped them to fit what I wanted to keep. Late one night, when there were no distractions left, one thought surfaced that I couldn't push away anymore. If this truly meant nothing, why did it require so much careful management? That question didn't accuse me. It didn't judge me. It just waited, and I knew I wouldn't be able to ignore it forever. Do you think self-control still counts when you keep choosing not to walk away? By the time I reached this point, I stopped pretending I was confused. What I felt wasn't confusion anymore. It was awareness. And awareness is uncomfortable because it removes plausible deniability. Once you see something clearly, you can't claim innocence the same way again. I started noticing how much mental space this situation occupied. Not loudly, not obsessively, but persistently. It lived in the background of my days, like a low hum I couldn't turn off. Even when I wasn't thinking about him directly, part of my attention felt allocated elsewhere, as if I were constantly holding something in reserve. That realization unsettled me. I prided myself on being present, on showing up fully in my relationship. Yet here I was, dividing myself quietly, telling myself it didn't count because it wasn't visible. But invisibility doesn't equal insignificance. If anything, it makes things harder to confront. I noticed how my behavior adjusted without me consciously deciding to change it. I lingered in shared spaces longer than necessary. I became more attentive to timing, to tone, to proximity. Not in a flirtatious way, in a careful way. And that care carried intention, whether I wanted to admit it or not. What frightened me was how reasonable all my justifications sounded. I told myself I was simply being aware, not attached. That maturity meant recognizing feelings without being ruled by them. That discipline meant staying close without crossing lines. Those explanations made me feel responsible, even virtuous. But slowly, I began to realize they were also protecting me from having to make a harder choice. At home, I became increasingly conscious of what I shared. Not because I was hiding a secret, but because I was managing a narrative. I simplified stories. I avoided certain details. I told myself I was sparing my partner unnecessary complexity. But deep down, I knew that honesty had become selective. That realization carried weight. I asked myself when transparency stopped feeling natural and started feeling risky, when openness turned into something I had to measure, instead of something I offered freely. I didn't like the answers forming in my mind. The guilt I felt wasn't about betrayal in the traditional sense. It was about misalignment, about living slightly off-center from my own values. The distance wasn't dramatic, but it was constant, and that constancy wore me down. I started questioning whether restraint alone could still be called loyalty. If I was doing everything right on the outside, but slowly shifting internally, was that still faithfulness? Or was it just delayed consequence? The most uncomfortable truth was this. I wasn't waiting for something to happen. I was waiting to see how long I could stay in this space without having to define it. And waiting, I realized, was its own form of permission. I told myself that if anything crossed a clear line, I would stop immediately. But relying on future restraint doesn't undo present allowance. By staying close, by staying engaged, by staying silent, I was already shaping outcomes, even if I refused to name them. Late one evening, sitting alone with my thoughts, I felt something shift. Not panic, not urgency, just a quiet recognition that this wasn't temporary anymore, that it hadn't faded on its own, that it had settled into me in a way that demanded acknowledgement. I didn't know yet what I was going to do, but I knew I could no longer tell myself that doing nothing was neutral. At this point, do you think awareness creates responsibility, even without action? Once awareness settled in, it began to change how I experienced everything else. Not dramatically, not in a way that would alarm anyone around me, but in subtle shifts that only I could feel. The world didn't look different. I did. I started noticing how often I caught myself pausing before reacting, before laughing, before answering, before sharing something personal. That pause wasn't about politeness anymore. It was about calculation, about deciding what version of myself was appropriate to show in each moment. That realization scared me. I had always believed that authenticity came naturally to me, that I didn't need to manage myself so carefully. Yet here I was, editing my presence without fully admitting why. I wasn't hiding a person. I was hiding a feeling. And hiding a feeling takes more energy than hiding facts. I became more protective of my internal space. If a thought surfaced that questioned what I was doing, I pushed it away quickly. I told myself I didn't have time to overanalyze, that I was being too hard on myself, that this was all part of being human. Those reassurances worked temporarily, but they left a residue, a quiet discomfort that never fully disappeared. At home, my relationship continued as usual on the surface. We talked about daily things. We planned ahead. We shared routines that felt familiar and safe. But inside, I felt a growing disconnect between what I was doing and what I was feeling. It wasn't distance from my partner. It was distance from myself. I noticed how certain questions made me uneasy, even when they were innocent. How was your day? Anything interesting happen? There was nothing to hide, yet answering fully felt complicated. Not because of what I would say, but because of what I would have to acknowledge internally while saying it. That's when I realized something uncomfortable. I had started protecting the feeling itself, not him. not a future, just the existence of that pull. I treated it like something fragile, something that needed to be preserved quietly. I justified that by telling myself it would pass, that acknowledging it too harshly would only give it more power. But the truth was simpler and harder to admit. I wasn't ready to let it go. That reluctance changed how I saw myself. I began questioning my own integrity in ways I never had before. Not because I thought I was a bad person, but because I felt misaligned. My actions and values were no longer moving in the same direction. That misalignment wasn't loud, but it was constant. And constant discomfort has a way of wearing you down. I felt more tired, even on days when nothing stressful happened. More irritable, without a clear reason. More withdrawn in moments that used to feel easy. Those emotional shifts didn't come from guilt alone. They came from internal division. I was living two realities at once. One where everything was fine, and another where I knew something needed to change. The problem was that change required naming the thing I had spent so long avoiding. And naming it would force me to confront what it said about me, about my needs, about the parts of myself I hadn't been paying attention to. I didn't want to be someone who drifted quietly into moral gray areas without noticing. And yet, that's exactly what I felt myself doing. Not out of malice, but out of avoidance. The hardest part wasn't deciding what was right. It was accepting that I had waited too long to protect what mattered. And that delay had already shaped who I was becoming. Do you think protecting a feeling can slowly change who you are, even if nothing ever happens? The cost didn't show up as chaos. There was no explosion, no argument, no obvious sign that something was wrong. That's what made it so easy to dismiss in the beginning. I told myself I was tired, that life was busy, that everyone feels disconnected sometimes. Those explanations were convenient and dangerously believable. But underneath them, something else was happening. I started feeling slightly out of sync with my own life. Moments that should have felt grounding felt muted instead. Conversations that used to energize me now required effort. I was still showing up, still participating, still doing everything I was supposed to do. But it felt mechanical. Like I was performing a version of myself rather than inhabiting it. What unsettled me most was how intentional my avoidance had become. At first, not talking about it felt passive, almost accidental. Later, it felt strategic. I was actively choosing not to sit with certain thoughts for too long. Choosing not to question why some moments affected me more than others. Choosing not to ask myself where this was heading, because I didn't like the answers that started forming when I did. Silence became a decision, not a default. I noticed how uncomfortable I had become with stillness. Quiet moments left too much space for reflection, and reflection led straight to discomfort. So I filled the space, with noise, with tasks, with distractions, anything that kept me from being alone with the part of myself that knew this wasn't sustainable. But when I was alone, truly alone, that's when the weight settled in. I would replay ordinary moments in my head and feel a wave of unease I couldn't fully explain, not because something had happened, but because something almost had. Or worse, because something had already shifted internally, and I hadn't stopped it when I still could have. That realization forced me to look at my relationship differently, not at what was wrong with it, but at what I was no longer fully giving to it. I asked myself whether I was still emotionally present in the way I expected my partner to be, whether my attention was as undivided as my loyalty claimed to be. Those questions didn't accuse me, they exposed me. I also began noticing how my sense of self was changing. I had always seen myself as someone principled, someone who handled discomfort directly. Now, I felt like I was living just slightly off-center from my own values. Not enough to shock myself into action, but enough to create a constant, low-grade discomfort that never fully disappeared. I wasn't doing something wrong loudly. I was compromising quietly. And quiet compromises are the hardest to confront because they don't demand immediate accountability. They allow you to tell yourself you'll fix things later, after you understand them better, after emotions settle, after something external forces your hand. But nothing external came. Instead, the internal pressure grew. I found myself thinking less about what was right and more about what was easiest. Less about integrity and more about maintaining balance. And that shift frightened me, because it suggested that I was slowly redefining my standards to fit my comfort rather than my values. I kept telling myself that restraint was enough, that as long as I didn't act, I was being responsible. But responsibility without honesty started to feel hollow, like a technicality rather than a truth. What finally became impossible to ignore was this: even without crossing a visible line, I was paying a price. In energy, in presence, in alignment. And that price was being paid daily, quietly, without resolution. I wasn't at a breaking point yet, but I could feel myself bending. And I knew that if I kept avoiding the truth, something would eventually give, whether I was ready or not. Do you think the real damage begins when we feel something, or when we keep pretending it doesn't matter? At some point, I stopped believing that time would fix this. Not because time had failed me before, but because I could feel what it was actually doing. It wasn't dissolving the weight. It was teaching me how to live with it. And that realization unsettled me more than panic ever could. I had adapted. That word stayed with me longer than I wanted it to. I hadn't healed. I hadn't resolved anything. I had simply learned how to organize my life around the discomfort. My days became structured in ways that left little room for reflection. I stayed busy, not because I was productive, but because stillness felt dangerous. Silence invited thoughts, and thoughts led straight back to questions I wasn't ready to answer. So I filled the space. With routines, with obligations, with noise. I became skilled at redirecting my own attention. Whenever my mind drifted toward that familiar tension, I nudged it elsewhere. I told myself this was emotional regulation, not avoidance. That there was no benefit in dwelling on something I wasn't acting on. But deep down, I knew the difference. Regulation calms you. Avoidance numbs you. And I was numb far more often than I wanted to admit. That numbness came with consequences. I felt emotionally tired without a clear reason. Small decisions felt heavier than they should. My patience thinned, even in situations that once felt easy. I wasn't overwhelmed by life. I was weighed down by division. Carrying something unresolved requires constant energy, even when you pretend it doesn't. What troubled me most was how carefully I handled my own honesty, not just with my partner, with myself. I softened language internally. I avoided direct labels. I chose words that made the situation sound manageable rather than accurate. Because accuracy demanded accountability, and accountability demanded change. And changing at that point felt like a loss I wasn't prepared to face. I had to confront a truth I didn't like. Nothing external was stopping me from choosing clarity. There was no obstacle, no pressure, no circumstance beyond my control. There was only fear. Fear of disruption, fear of destabilizing something that still worked, fear of losing a feeling I had quietly allowed myself to grow attached to. That last one was the hardest to admit, because it meant acknowledging that part of me didn't want this to end. Not because I wanted to pursue it openly, but because ending it would force me to admit it mattered, and admitting that would shatter the story I had been telling myself, that this was all about restraint, discipline, and moral strength. I wasn't standing still anymore. Even without action, I was moving. Emotionally, mentally, I was inching toward a version of myself that needed increasingly complex justifications to feel innocent. And justification, I realized, is often the quiet bridge between boundaries and permission. That realization stayed with me. I started asking myself questions I could no longer push away. If my partner could see my inner life, would they still feel secure? If honesty were measured by transparency rather than technicality, would I still feel faithful? And if I continued exactly like this, who would I be teaching myself to become? Those questions followed me everywhere. They didn't demand immediate answers. They demanded awareness. And awareness made it impossible to pretend this was still harmless. I finally understood something I had avoided for too long. Waiting for certainty was just another form of avoidance. Certainty doesn't arrive before action. It follows it. And by refusing to act, I was choosing familiarity over integrity. That thought scared me. Because it meant this wasn't about temptation anymore. It wasn't about another person. It was about whether I was willing to live with a version of myself that relied on silence to feel safe. I could feel the pressure building. Not the pressure to confess everything, not the pressure to make a dramatic decision, but the pressure to stop living divided. And for the first time, I knew something would have to change soon, not because of circumstances, but because I was reaching the limit of what I could justify to myself. If clarity threatens your comfort, do you think it's still worth choosing? Once I accepted that something would have to change, I expected clarity to follow. I thought that realization alone would bring relief. Instead, it brought fear. Not panic, fear in its quieter form. The kind that makes you hesitate, even when you know staying still is no longer an option. I started noticing how close this had come to leaving my internal world. Not through words, not through actions, but through energy. I realized that my attention had become uneven, that I was more alert in certain spaces, more subdued in others. I wasn't hiding anything specific, but I was managing myself constantly. And management, I learned, is exhausting when it replaces honesty. There were moments when my partner would look at me, not suspiciously, not accusingly, just attentively. And in those moments, I felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with guilt and everything to do with awareness. I wondered what they would see if they knew what I carried silently. Not the details, the distance. That thought lingered longer than it should have. I realized that I had underestimated how much internal conflict shows itself externally, even when we believe we're hiding it well, even when we're careful, even when we tell ourselves no one could possibly notice. Distance doesn't announce itself. It settles. I started sensing it in small interactions, in pauses that felt slightly longer, in responses that felt slightly flatter, in moments where I chose safety over spontaneity. None of it dramatic, all of it cumulative. What frightened me most was that I hadn't intended any of this. I hadn't wanted to withdraw. I hadn't wanted to protect something silently. I hadn't wanted to feel divided. And yet, intention didn't erase impact. I also began to see how fragile my sense of control actually was. I had believed that because I hadn't acted, I was in charge. But control that relies on constant vigilance isn't stability. It's tension disguised as discipline. I started asking myself whether I was truly choosing restraint or simply postponing responsibility, because postponement had consequences. The longer I stayed silent, the harder honesty felt. Not because the truth became worse, but because admitting it would mean acknowledging how long I had carried it alone, how much space it had taken, how deeply it had shaped my inner world without ever being spoken. I noticed something else too. Part of me feared that if I named it, even privately, it would become real in a way I couldn't undo. That the moment I allowed myself to say this mattered, I would lose control entirely. And so I kept it unnamed, believing that silence was containment. But silence wasn't containing it. It was allowing it to settle deeper. I realized then that I wasn't just afraid of hurting my partner. I was afraid of confronting the version of myself that had let this grow quietly, afraid of seeing my own vulnerability so clearly that I could no longer look away from it. That fear kept me suspended, not moving forward, not stepping back, just existing in a space that felt increasingly unstable. I could feel that I was approaching a moment where not choosing would become a choice of its own, where inaction would shape outcomes just as clearly as action ever could. And I didn't know yet which consequence I was more afraid of, the one that came from speaking, or the one that came from staying silent a little longer. If silence is already changing things, do you think waiting makes it safer or more dangerous? By the time I reached this stage, the tension was no longer something I could compartmentalize. It had stopped being a background presence and started shaping how I experienced my own life. Not loudly, not dramatically, but persistently, in ways that made it impossible to ignore. I began to realize that I was constantly bracing myself, not for discovery, not for confrontation, but for exposure. There's a difference between being afraid of getting caught and being afraid of being seen. I wasn't worried that someone would accuse me of something specific. I was worried that someone might notice the quiet distance I carried, the slight hesitation, the emotional restraint, the version of myself that no longer felt fully aligned. That fear followed me into ordinary moments. Simple questions felt heavier than they should have. Shared silence felt charged instead of comforting. Even moments of connection carried an undercurrent of awareness that made it harder to relax into them fully. I was present, but guarded. Engaged, but restrained. And that restraint was becoming more visible to me with every passing day. I realized I had underestimated how much effort it takes to live divided, holding two internal truths at once. Nothing has happened and something has changed. Required constant negotiation. I had to keep reassuring myself that I was still being faithful, still being responsible, still being good. But the more I reassured myself, the more fragile that belief became. Because reassurance isn't proof, and repetition doesn't create truth. What unsettled me most was how close I felt to a moment that hadn't happened yet. A conversation, a question, a look held just a second too long. I wasn't anticipating disaster. I was anticipating clarity. And clarity, I knew, would demand something from me that I wasn't sure I was ready to give. I also started to see how my internal conflict was reshaping my emotional availability. I was offering care, but not vulnerability, attention, but not openness. I was protecting others from discomfort. Yes, but I was also protecting myself from accountability. That realization stripped away one of my last justifications. I had told myself that silence was an act of care, that I was sparing my partner unnecessary confusion, that honesty would only create pain where none was needed. But slowly, I began to see that this logic placed my comfort above integrity, and that distinction mattered. I asked myself what I would want if the roles were reversed. Not details, not confessions meant to ease guilt, but presence, alignment, emotional honesty. And the fact that I wasn't offering that fully made it impossible to keep pretending I was doing the right thing by staying quiet. The hardest part wasn't deciding what was fair. It was admitting that I had waited too long to protect what mattered, and that waiting had already changed the dynamic in ways I couldn't undo. I felt myself approaching an edge. Not a dramatic cliff. A quiet threshold. The kind you cross not with a single step, but with accumulated hesitation. And once crossed, you don't return to the same internal landscape. Something shifts. Something demands acknowledgement. I didn't know yet what I was going to do, but I knew that the space I was occupying, this suspended, unnamed tension, was no longer sustainable. Not because of anyone else's expectations, but because I was losing my ability to recognize myself within it. And that loss frightened me more than any potential outcome ever could. If you realize you're slowly disappearing inside your own silence, do you think it's already time to speak, even if you don't know what to say yet? Once I accepted that silence was no longer neutral, I couldn't return to the version of myself that believed waiting was harmless. That belief collapsed quietly, without drama, leaving behind a clarity that felt heavier than confusion ever had. I began to see my own inaction as a form of choice, not a temporary pause, not a protective measure, a decision to keep things exactly as they were, even though, as they were, was slowly reshaping me. That realization stripped away my last layer of comfort. I stopped asking myself what might happen and started asking what already had, and the answer wasn't subtle anymore. I had become more guarded, more selective, less emotionally available in ways that mattered. I wasn't lying, but I wasn't fully honest either. And that space between those two things felt increasingly difficult to defend. I noticed how often I rehearsed explanations in my head. Not confessions. Explanations, versions of the truth that sounded reasonable, controlled, responsible. Ways of framing things that protected me from judgment, especially my own. That rehearsal scared me, because it meant I was already preparing for consequences, even while pretending there was nothing to resolve. It meant that some part of me knew this couldn't stay unspoken forever, no matter how carefully I managed it. I also had to confront something deeply uncomfortable. I had underestimated my own attachment. Not attachment to a person, attachment to a feeling, to how it made me feel more awake, more seen, more connected to parts of myself I hadn't noticed were missing. Admitting that felt humiliating, because it challenged the story I told myself about discipline and control. I wasn't tempted because I was reckless. I was tempted because I was human. That truth didn't excuse anything, but it explained why denial had been so easy. I realized then that I had been measuring loyalty by the wrong standard. I had been asking whether I crossed a visible line, instead of asking whether I was living in alignment with my values. And those are not the same thing. The distance between who I was and who I believed myself to be had grown slowly, but steadily. And now that I could see it clearly, pretending it wasn't there felt like its own kind of dishonesty. I stood at the edge of a decision that didn't offer a clean outcome. There was no version of this where nothing was lost. No choice that didn't carry discomfort. Either I would name what had been shaping me quietly and risk destabilizing what I had, or I would continue carrying it and accept the person I was becoming as a result. What frightened me most wasn't the potential reaction of others. It was the certainty that if I stayed silent, I would eventually normalize this divided state, and that normalization would cost me something I wouldn't know how to recover later. I didn't know yet what words I would use. I didn't know how much truth I was capable of offering. But I knew this. The next step wouldn't be passive. Whatever I chose next would be intentional. And once I made that choice, I wouldn't be able to call this a misunderstanding, a phase, or a harmless internal conflict anymore. It would become a line I had either stepped away from or crossed in my own way. If every option carries a loss, how do you decide which one you can live with? I didn't make my decision in a moment of bravery. There was no surge of confidence, no feeling of empowerment. What pushed me forward was exhaustion. I was tired of carrying something that had no name but demanded constant attention, tired of managing myself, tired of negotiating with my own values. I chose clarity, not because it felt right, but because continuing to live divided felt worse. The first thing I did was create distance, not dramatically, not with explanations that invited questions, just distance that was intentional and unmistakable. I removed myself from situations that required constant self-monitoring. I stopped feeding something I had spent so long pretending wasn't growing. That choice hurt more than I expected, not because I was losing someone, but because I was letting go of a version of myself that had felt briefly awake, briefly seen. Mourning that surprised me. It forced me to admit how deeply this had affected me, even without a single visible line being crossed. Then came honesty, but not the kind meant to ease my guilt. I didn't unload every thought or describe every internal struggle. I spoke about distance, about realizing I hadn't been as emotionally present as I wanted to be, about recognizing a drift before it turned into something neither of us could recognize anymore. I owned my absence without shifting blame or seeking absolution. That conversation didn't resolve everything, but it changed the direction. What followed wasn't immediate healing. It was rebuilding, slowly, uncomfortably, with more awareness than before. I had to accept that restraint alone isn't loyalty, and that silence, when it protects comfort instead of integrity, becomes its own kind of harm. I also had to face myself honestly, not as someone who almost cheated, but as someone who learned, painfully, that fidelity isn't only about actions. It's about what you allow to grow quietly. It's about the choices you make long before anyone else would call them mistakes. I don't know if everyone would agree with how I handled it in the end. I do know this. Choosing alignment over avoidance gave me something back that I didn't realize I was losing, respect for myself, and that mattered more than preserving a version of peace built on silence. Living through this taught me that wanting doesn't make you disloyal. Avoiding responsibility does. And if I could go back, I wouldn't wait so long to listen to the discomfort that tried to warn me. Because discomfort, I learned, isn't always a threat. Sometimes, it's an invitation to become honest before you lose yourself completely. Do you think I made the right choice in the end? If you enjoy real, thought-provoking Reddit-style stories, subscribe to the channel for more.